Recording.
Today is Tuesday, October 5, 2021, and this is the day that the Center for the History of Family Medicine is doing an oral history on one of the luminaries in our specialty, Dr. John Saultz. I am Dr. Dan Ostergaard. I am here in Olathe, Kansas in my home office. You can see the map behind me. John looks like he's in his home office in Portland, Oregon. Yep. It's a particular privilege for me to introduce Dr. Saultz because I've watched him through much of his tremendous history with the specialty, and I'm glad to introduce him further. Now, unfortunately, his CV is so long, I didn't even read it all, but I know a few chunks of it. So, John, what we'll do is we will go through kind of your pedigree all the way from being a kid, and I think it was Ohio, on through many of your roles. And if you just start with that, you're growing up, family, back home.
Well, I grew up in a small town in Ohio, in southwestern Ohio, that still, I think to this day, only has 2 stoplights in it. My father worked for the Air Force in a civil service capacity. My wife and I went to high school together. We started dating when we were juniors in high school, and we've been together since then. I think we've been married now. We got married in 1976, so we're 45 years married and with 3 children. But growing up, I think it's fair to say I wanted to be a teacher. I was very interested in mathematics, and I thought I'd be a math teacher. But my father had a life-threatening illness in my junior high years, and I was very frustrated with the health care that he got. It was not a problem with the family doctor in our little town. It was a problem with the plethora of specialists that they referred my father to, who took a very long time to finally make a diagnosis of celiac disease. He stopped eating gluten and got well, and I wondered why it took 5 years to figure that out. So I probably got into medicine because of that, although I wouldn't say that I decided to go to medical school until I was in college at Ohio State, majoring in math on an ROTC scholarship with a commitment to the military. So I did undergrad in 3 years and then medical school in 3 years. And so I was young. I came out of medical school, I think I was 23 years old, and had a service commitment to the military. So I did my residency in the Army and then spent 4 years after that paying back that service commitment before I started my career out of the military.
And where did you go to med school?
So I went to undergrad and medical school at Ohio State. I was in an early interview program there. Ohio State accepted me right after my interview in the early fall as an early matriculant. And so I canceled all of my other medical school's interviews. I actually only had 1 medical school interview in my life. And then I sent rejection letters to the other schools I had applied to. So I can't say I got a lot of experience with that, but it was an interesting interview. I was interviewed by a faculty member from neurology and by the chair of the anatomy department at Ohio State. And the chair of the anatomy department was a very beloved faculty member, ultimately somebody that almost all the students really liked. And I don't remember very much about the neurologist, except for the 2 of them in the interview asked me what I was interested in doing with my career. And no one in my family had been in medicine before, and I literally knew just about general practice, right? I thought I wanted to go to a small town like the town I grew up in and be a general physician there. So I told him I was interested in being a small town family doctor, and the neurologist said to me, these were almost his exact words. Well, John, we've looked at your academic record here, and you don't need to tell us that because you'll probably get into medical school anyway. So what is it that you really want to do? And I was really kind of shocked because that was what I really wanted to do. But it was my first experience with the fact that the academic world doesn't always respect what family doctors do. And certainly in those days, that was a prevalent attitude, I think, when I was a medical student, because the Department of Family Medicine at Ohio State was still very new then. This was in the 70s. And I don't remember anything else about that guy, but I remember that question. And it was sort of an interesting beginning to talking to people about family medicine.
Well, unfortunately, we still hear that kind of bias today from folks such as your neurologist. And I guess the assumption was on his part, you said you wanted to go into family medicine so you'd have a better shot of getting into med school. And he said, well, what do you really want to do? It still makes me mad to hear that, but
well, I wasn't overly harmed by it, Dan.
Okay.
I was amused. I will say that I was amused.
So you are now in med school and you have a commitment to the Army. So how did you choose family medicine in the Army? What I mean, was that back to the GP and then on forward from there?
So I'm not sure whether as an applicant to medical school that I really knew that family medicine was becoming a specialty, something separate from general practice. I may or may not have known that. I don't.
What year was that?
I was applying to medical school in 1975. Okay.
Right.
But by the time I got into medical school, starting in the summer of 76, there was a Department of Family Medicine at Ohio State, and it was not something that I had much of a chance to interact with as a student. There wasn't really curriculum time. There wasn't a required rotation. And it was really clear that they were kind of invisible in the academic health center. And so I started doing my core clerkships. I finished the preclinical curriculum, which is usually the first 2 years of medical school. Because I was in an independent study program, I did them in about 10 months.
Oh.
And so I started the clerkship at the start of my second year of medical school. And I liked all of the clerkships a lot. I thought that the surgeons stood around in the operating room too much and my feet got sore. I didn't like the standing, but I really liked what they did. And I liked all of the specialties. I would say by the time I finished the core clerkships, I was not at all sure that I didn't want to give up anything in medicine. I wanted to do all of that. But I wasn't sure whether family medicine was for me because I didn't really, I hadn't really seen a family doctor in a setting doing things that were the sort of practice I wanted to have. And early in my last year of medical school, I had an elective, a pediatric infectious disease elective at the Columbus Children's Hospital. And during that time, I was one of 2 medical students on a team with a second-year pediatric resident, a first-year pediatric resident, and a family medicine resident from the Grant Hospital program in Columbus. And his name was Bill Morris. And this would have been in February, I think, of that academic year, which means it was about halfway through Bill's internship. And I was pretty well on the road to being a pediatrician. Kind of a hospital-based pediatrician because I really thought that work was important. And one night, this was before there was emergency medicine, you remember. One night they brought in a 17-year-old African-American man who was in cardiac arrest in the ambulance. And they brought him to the Children's Hospital because it was the closest place and he wasn't 18 yet. And our team was called down for the code, and the pediatric residents were trying to figure out how many milligrams per kilogram of epinephrine to give the patient. And the family medicine intern took over the code and ran it because he had just done adult medicine. And It was essentially an adult code from a physiological point of view. Okay. And a light came on for me that night that I always saw family doctors playing on other people's home turf. I saw family medicine residents on obstetrics and on medicine and on surgery, but I never saw them on their home field. And that when you took a pediatrician away from children, they were almost useless. Okay. So if you see a surgeon with a chest pain patient or an internist with a thrombosed hemorrhoid, they're lost. And yet they claim that the family doctor is the one that's lost. And so that vision of comprehensiveness, that I wanted to be able to be the doctor that took care of everybody no matter what, that seemed like the coolest thing you could do with a medical career. Okay. So I know a lot of people are attracted to family medicine because of the service ethic of the profession. I know there's a lot that are attracted to the notion of continuity relationships with families. And I've done a lot of my research over my career about continuity of care and the importance of relationship in healthcare. But I went into family medicine, Dan, because it was the hardest thing you could do in medicine. And I thought to be a great doctor, you shouldn't be having the excuse of giving up whole areas of medicine because you're too lazy to study them.
Wow. That's a great impetus and also a great story. And I haven't read everything you've written, but I assume you've written up that history in the ER when the family medicine intern took over the code, because that's really fantastic. Have you written that up?
I've not. I've told that story to generations of students about, that's why early on in my career in Oregon, we would put so much energy into having required rotations in frontier communities in Oregon. I would tell them, you need to go to a place where there's a 30-bed hospital and 3 family doctors that take care of everyone with nobody else in town and see what they do. Because if you see that, you see the way the foundation of the American healthcare system should work everywhere. It's more efficient, it's more humane, and the outcomes are better. Okay. So, and I mean outcomes in terms of how the community does, right? I think there's reasonably good evidence of that. I think that's at the root of a lot of Starfield's data. Barbara Starfield would tell you, if she were here, that comprehensiveness is the key thing that accounts for the outcomes and efficiency that she found in her data, comparing communities with high primary care scores and non-high primary care scores. So I've told the story a lot. I've never written about that. Maybe someday I will. I have been back to Columbus. I've never really talked to Dr. Morris again, but he had a wonderful career as a family doctor in suburban Columbus. And I've given him a lot of credit at a distance. Because that was a pretty transformative experience for me. It's not that I might not have gone into family medicine anyway, but I was not going to go into anything else after that night.
Well, I think it'd be good to have you talk a little bit about your metamorphosis then from that life-changing, transforming moment into your residency in the military. But before that, I got to ask you, in those early days at Ohio State, was the first chair Tennyson Williams?
Yes.
It was. Yeah, I remember him well. He was the founder. Okay, what about Eisenhower Medical Center residency and then you did some more work in the military?
So in the spring of 1978, I had an elective to do, and I had decided that although the Army did not require me to do my residency in the Army, there was substantial risk if I didn't that I would be brought into the military as a general medical officer after my internship year. And I had a really, really strong desire to finish my residency right out of medical school and not to divide up my residency with a 1-year internship and then a general medical officer stint with the troops someplace. I wanted to do the whole residency. And the best path to do that was to do a military residency. But then the question was, am I going to be happy with the training in the military? What did I know about Army family medicine training? So in May of 1978, I did a 1-month elective at Madigan Hospital at Fort Lewis out in Tacoma. It was my first trip to the Northwest. I'd never been out here before. I'd been to California as a kid, but never to Oregon or Washington. And so I went out there. My wife was newly pregnant with our first child, and she was back in Columbus. And so I was staying in the bachelor's officers' quarters there. And I worked with some magnificent military family physicians there and thinking, well, Tacoma looks like maybe the place to be. And I asked everybody that I met in the Army, so where's the best Army family medicine residency? Which one is the best program? And the majority, an awful lot of the people told you the place where they went was the best program. But everybody said Fort Gordon in Augusta, Georgia was in the top two. And the reason was because they had really astonishing leadership then. And the program existed at a window in time when I was there that was completely serendipitous. So the chief that built the program there was a guy named Mike Scotty. And you may know Mike Scotty because he eventually became Speaker of the House of the AMA and Surgeon General of the Army, I think.
I knew him well. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us.
He's not, but everybody there revered him. And he had built this program that he sort of like, we're going to build the most elite family medicine program that can be, and we're going to do everything. Now, Eisenhower had been a military community hospital, and about 1973 or so, they built this big academic health center with the goal of making it a health center like Walter Reed and Brooke and Fitzsimmons that was a referral center. So it went from being a community hospital to a referral center. And the plan was to take some of the referral load off of Walter Reed by sending the patients coming out of the southeastern United States and the Caribbean to Eisenhower instead. The program, when it became a medical center, had a family medicine program that had started in the early 70s and a psychiatry program. But there was no medicine, surgery, pediatrics, or anything. And so it had the characteristics of an unopposed program in terms of but when I arrived as an intern in 1979, the Army was starting a family internal medicine and surgery residency there for the first time. So during my internship year, there was a 12-12-12 family medicine program that was probably the hardest Army residency to get into for family medicine. Okay. There were 4 first-year and 4 second-year medicine residents who were mostly people who didn't get into the good internal medicine residencies in the military. And there were 4 surgery first years and 4 surgery second years. And so the family medicine senior residents ran the hospital. As a resident there, I was the officer of the day in the emergency department. There was not emergency medicine yet. So I would be overseeing the adult provider and the pediatric provider that were on call schedules. You remember back we used to have call schedules and all of the physicians in the hospital had to cover the ER. So as a third-year resident, I was supervising the chief of the orthopedics department, who was one of the people seeing patients with a family medicine intern. He comes to me and says, there's this kid in here that has a rash and he's really, really sick. I went in and said, well, you know, Colonel so-and-so, those are Koplik spots, and that's a morbilliform rash, and this child has measles. And he said, but he's really sick. And I said, yeah, people with measles are really sick. It's a bad disease. We don't see that much anymore. It was, you know, I don't know why there was a measles case there because the vaccine was already available at that point. But anyway, the point I'm getting at is in the class of residents that were there, so a 5-year window, the 2 classes ahead of me, my class, and the 2 classes behind me, I think that program produced at least a half a dozen family medicine department chairs. Gerald Cross was in my class. He became Undersecretary of Veterans Affairs for the VA health system. Jeanette Southpaw was in my class. Greg Blake was 2 years ahead of me. He was the chair at Tennessee, I think. Dave Manus was a class behind me. He was the chair at maybe Arkansas. I don't know. But we had a lot of really, really successful people. I said Jeanette Southpole was a classmate of mine in that class with Gerald Cross. So of the 12 of us, everybody kind of like we were ambitious people. We were sort of there because we wanted to partake in what Mike Scotty had built. Now today, those residencies, it's much more like an Army medical center because there's fully developed medicine and surgery residencies. But I was there when it had all of the subspecialties populated to become an academic health center, but no trainees that could compete with the family medicine physicians. So we were actually the dominant specialty there, not the only one, but the dominant one, which was pretty unprecedented in the late 70s and early 80s.
Well, you mentioned some other luminaries, particularly you twice mentioned Jeanette Southpole, and she as maybe many who watch this or listen to this or read this know, she also went to the Uniformed Services School in Bethesda and had a long career there before she went to Pittsburgh.
Yep.
Anyway, John, let's transfer to off residency to your post-residency career and its trajectory. And in that, of course, we'll spend most of of this time at OHSU. But kind of talk about that transition, will you please?
So my plan when I went into the military was to do my residency, pay back my 4-year obligation, and go to a small town and be a family doctor. That's what I was going to do. That plan changed pretty fast in the first 3 or 4 months of my second year of residency, because when I was the senior resident with a team of interns and medical students working with me, it sort of dawned on me that my destiny was to be a teacher in medicine and not a practitioner who taught. Now, John Fry and I have talked about this a lot, that I think all good family doctors have teaching in their blood, because we teach patients and we are, as a specialty, pretty welcoming to students coming to work with us. And so I always thought that was part of the professional obligation of a physician. That's what's included in the Oath of Geneva, the Oath of Hippocrates, teaching the next generation right. But I really fell in love with the teaching role. And by the time I was done with my second year of residency, I wanted to teach family medicine for a living and practice it, as opposed to practice family medicine for a living and teach, if that makes any sense. And so I was then thinking, how can I finish my residency and get involved in teaching as soon as I can? The Army at the time was tending to use its teaching programs as tools to keep people, to have people stay. So they'd send you out to some place to practice for a couple of years and then offer you to let you be in a teaching program if you would agree to re-up and stay. There was not any chance under any circumstance for any reason that I would re-up in the military, because I was not a happy camper. I was a devotee of the TV show MASH, and I was really ready to be done with that as soon as I could. Although I would have to say my experience in the Army was wonderful, and I made great friends. The patients were terrific. But the Army's primary mission is not its healthcare system. It's defending the country, right? And I thought that, healthcare was what I wanted the job to be about. Right? So I then started looking for faculty positions when I finished my 4-year obligation. So I got out of residency. My residency director during that time was a guy named Dale Carroll. And he was an early joint boarded person with family medicine and preventive medicine. And Dale got promoted to be the department chief at Fort Benning the year that I finished my residency, and took me with him to be a faculty member there, which was a big deal because not that many people got to go into teaching programs right out of residency. I went there right out of residency. Now, I was a brigade surgeon for the first year I was there, which means I was seeing patients a lot. It wasn't like I was, doing 1/2 day a week of patient care and running a residency. I was very clinically active during that time. But by the time I was in my second, third, and fourth year out of residency, I was primarily working in what amounts to a community hospital residency as a team leader and attending on the hospital service and precepting in the clinic and seeing my own patients and the like. And the Army was kind enough to send me to do a faculty development fellowship at the University of North Carolina back at a time when several of our departments like Washington and Missouri and North Carolina and Duke had federal grants to do faculty development. Those were HRSA faculty development grants, and Chapel Hill built a program that had both civilian and military faculty coming from community residencies to do, you know, if you didn't move to Chapel Hill, you went there for, I think, 5 weeks during the year, and then you had all these take-home projects that you would do when you went back to your program. So my second year out of residency, I was a fellow at Chapel Hill, and that's where I met Bob Taylor. He was at Newman Gray then, and he came over to teach a workshop on writing for publication. And I was impressed with how he did that workshop. Bob had a very characteristic way of doing teaching workshops. He would write down a map with the names of all the people around the table on it so that he would call people by name. And I just thought that was very clever. I'd never seen anybody do that before, but it made the session feel a lot more intimate. And he decided to take the position in 1984 out in Oregon as the chair, which was the year after my fellowship. So when I was ready to get out of the military, I had a very early IBM computer, and I printed up a mail merge and sent out my CV in a letter asking if there were available faculty positions. And I sent it to 82 places. All of the community programs in Ohio, but I also sent it to all of the medical schools in the Northeast. And I wanted to be in the Northeast within driving distance because remember, Sherry and I went to high school together, and I wanted to be close enough to be able to go home for holidays and stuff like that, right? And I had decided that maybe the thing for me to do is to teach undergraduate medical education for a while, because I had been working with residents for 4 years. And the thing that I was most frustrated about is that we weren't getting the best medical students to choose family medicine because the medical schools were not where our strongest programs were. And in my view, it's particularly stupid to the point of suicidal to have your weakest residencies where the medical students are, okay? So we should go and fix that, which means some people that are really serious about this need to go to these medical schools and turn that around, right? That have that not be the case anymore. The only letter I sent west of the Mississippi River went to Oregon. And I sent it there. I'd never been to Oregon before. I'd only been to the Northwest for that 1 month elective back in medical school. But Bob Taylor was the chair here. And I thought, you know what? I'm 3 years out of residency now. I'm a pretty good family doctor. I'm a pretty good teacher. But I don't know much about scholarship. And if I'm going to be at a medical school, then I'm going to have to be able to write and publish enough stuff that I can survive there. And I need to go somewhere where somebody can teach me that. And this guy, Taylor, he writes books. And I think I could learn that from him. So I sent him the CV. And literally, Dan, I'm not kidding. I took this letter and before I put it in the mailbox, and I showed my wife and I said, now we shouldn't mail this if we're not serious about it. Would you be willing to go to Oregon if this turns out? Because our plan was Ohio or Michigan or Indiana or Pennsylvania, right? And she said, well, it doesn't hurt anything to mail it. Okay. So that was not exactly a yes, but it was not a no either. And so we put it in the mail, and about 2 or 3 months later, I got a call from him. It was at 10 o'clock at night Eastern time. And he called me on the phone and he said, John, this is Bob Taylor. I got your letter here. And I want to know if you would be willing to come out here and interview for the job of residency director. And I said, well, Bob, I'm only 3 years out of my own residency, and I'm only 29 years old. And my experience thus far has entirely been in a military program. I'm not sure I'm ready to be a residency director at a university program like Oregon. And he said, well, I've talked to a bunch of people, and we think you are. So if you would be willing to come out here, you can bring your wife and stay for 4 or 5 days and learn about the area. Okay. So I got
Go ahead.
So I figured, well, what the heck? I got my parents to watch the kids, and Sherry and I came out here, and they put us up in a nice hotel, and they wined us and dined us, and he gave his credit card to the residents to take me out anywhere they wanted. I thought that was pretty cool. He had me meeting with chairs of other departments and with other residency directors in medicine and surgery, and he really had a vision that was quite appealing, but the residency wasn't really strong just then. I mean, he had 2 of the intern class that were not having their contracts renewed. And the founding program director and he had not seen eye to eye because the founding program director hadn't seen any patients for 4 or 5 years. And Bob did not think a residency director should be clinically inactive. So he decided to replace him and did this search. And I will tell you one story about that interview week that probably as much as anything got me to Oregon. Because I know you and Bob Taylor are friends, and you may or may not have heard this story. So while I was there as a candidate interviewing for the program director job, I sat in with Bob on a residency interview session. So the residency applicants would show up. This was in November of the year, so there was applicant season going on. They would show up, and Bob would talk to him for a little bit. Then they'd have their interviews and a tour of the place, right? And he's talking to them, and he gets to the end of his why this is a good residency and why Oregon is going to build this strong program. And he asks if there's any questions. And if you've been involved with any of these things, there's always some well-washed little brown nosers that want to ask a question to try and impress the chair, right? So this student said, well, Dr. Taylor, what is the most important attribute you're looking for in a resident in your program? And Bob said, passion. And the student said, you mean compassion? And Bob goes, no, I want people here so passionate about family medicine that they have trouble thinking about anything else.
Wow.
And I thought, well, you know what? I'm kind of like that. I really kind of am. The student looked kind of surprised, but ultimately that sort of approach had a big, that determined a lot about who was there. Bob decided he was only going to recruit residency trained, experienced academicians into faculty positions as people retired. And that was ahead of its time, because the prevailing wisdom then was that you should practice for 5 or 10 years and then go to your academic career with seasoned and well-developed clinical skills, right? Bob said, well, you should have well-developed clinical skills and you should use them throughout your academic career. That the idea that you're going to practice a lot and then scale back your practice and teach, that teaching flows from practice. And I would say that scholarship also flows from practice. Okay. And so our ethic out here has been that, well, we're not going to sit around and precept residents all the time. We're going to deliver patient care with them. And does that make sense?
Yeah, total sense. And as I've watched you, that is exactly what you've done. You're still taking care of patients that you took care of throughout the entire time you've been in Portland. But I got to do one interpretation and then one personal note. The interpretation is because there's 2 Robert Taylors within the family practice background, the one of which we're speaking, which everybody who knows academic family medicine will know, is Dr. Robert Taylor, who wrote the series, I think it was 6 different editions of family medicine. And he started when he was in practice in New Paltz, New York. So he didn't start as an academic. He started writing his books from the practice perspective. And the second is a personal note. So sometime in the 80s, you and I and Bob Taylor were together at some meeting. And Bob sought me out and he dragged you along and he said to me, I got to introduce you to John Saultz. He is going to be a major leader in our specialty. And I don't know if you remember that, but I certainly remember that. Do you remember that?
I do. Bob said that kind of thing a lot, and in fairness, he also promoted people like Scott Fields and Bill Toffler
Yeah.
and Eric Wall that way. He was very passionate about mentoring and developing people. When I arrived here to be on the faculty, and discovered, in addition to an RRC site visit that was happening 3 months after I became the program director, and I needed to fill out the program information form for that. He also invited me to write a textbook chapter in the third edition of his book, and there was a HRSA grant that was due. And so, in addition to being a residency director, brand new in the job, I had these three major writing projects that all had to be done in the first 4 months I was here. And I came here to learn to write. So here's a grant and a book chapter and a program information form. See how fast you can produce those. And we didn't have PCs then, so Bob had a system of dictating and a typist that would transcribe what you dictated. And then the editing was done off the typewritten page. It was not word processing. And I remember, so I would edit this thing, then I'd give it to him to look at. And the first drafts of these things came back looking like a murder had taken place. There was so much red on those pages. It's kind of like, gosh, he says, you take too many words to say too little. But he is one of the most astonishing editors that this discipline has produced. And I am the product of what I was able to learn from him as a mentor and as an editor. And so Bob, to the extent that people like Scott Fields and I have had successful careers, we owe a great deal of that to Bob. And I went there very intentionally thinking that that's what I could get from Bob. And he did not disappoint.
Well, you have been talking about kind of your first role at Oregon Health Sciences University, that of the program director. But take us through more. So you've talked a little about being the PD. I don't remember how long you were the PD, and then you, at some point, you went into the dean's office or the president's office, and then became chair again. Kind of go through that chronology with us, because I'm pretty sure most people don't know all of that.
So Bob's recruitment started with Eric Wall and Bill Toffler the year after he arrived as the chair. He came in 1984, and Bill and Eric came in 85. And then he recruited Dean McGinty and I to come there in 86. And so I was sort of the last of the pieces. When I arrived there, there were a couple of existing faculty members from the previous administration, and there was Bob and Eric and Bill. There were like 6 faculty members and Bob. I mean, we sat around the table and didn't eat all of a dozen donuts when we had a faculty meeting. Okay. Now, Dan, there's now over 200 faculty members in our department here. So that was a pretty humble beginning. And because we all had a job, so Eric was the research director and Bill was the clinic director and McGinty was the medical student education director and I was the residency director. Now, residency there was an 888 program, and it was me and a half-time administrative assistant. There were no associate residency directors. Everybody precepted in the clinic, but we all had to support each other's roles. So Eric was only going to be successful as the research director if all of us did research. Dean was only going to be successful as the medical student education director if all of us taught students. And I was only going to be successful as a residency director if all of us taught residents. Well, you can imagine there was a lot of tugging and pulling about how exactly to do all of that. I think my first 2 or 3 years as the residency director, I won the resident teaching award. And people look at that on my CV and says, well, that's kind of an impressive record, you know, of teaching awards one year after the next. I said, but I was the only guy. You know, I would have had it been really bad. You know, I was sort of the only one. And so pretty soon we started getting grants. And it was HRSA grants and it was clinical practice revenue. We were working really, really hard all the time. And we got HRSA grants that allowed us to bring in a couple of associate residency directors. And by the end of the 80s, I had 3 associate residency directors, Glenn Rodriguez, Patrice Eve, who became really well known in sports medicine for her fracture book, and a guy named Mark Majorick. And so the department was beginning to fill out. We had this skeleton. Bob had an illness in the late 80s, and I became the vice chair of the department when he had to take a medical leave. And I was still an assistant professor at the time. But it was sort of like one of us had to go to the meetings that he wasn't there for. And I had more interaction with the other departments because the residency was more outward facing than research or medical education. So we continued to grow. We got a bunch of things happened here that are stories for another day about the university all at once deciding that rural Oregon really mattered. So we had lost our university president, and there were a couple of family doctors out in the extreme northeast corner of the state in a town called Enterprise that did a survey of doctors in Eastern Oregon, and they were all burned out and unhappy and feeling unsupported. And they got the attention of the Oregonian, and there was a big Sunday feature in the Oregonian about the death of rural medical care in our state. And there was a documentary that was done, The Death of Rural Practice, by the public broadcasting, Oregon Public Broadcasting. And the dean of the medical school, who's a really wonderful guy, he was the dean that hired Bob Taylor, but he was a research endocrinologist. He was really, really scared that the university would get blamed because we were the only academic setting, the only producer of doctors in the state. And these rural doctors were yelling that there's nobody coming out here. And, you know, Oregon has always a little bit been an orphan, because whereas California had a network of residencies that John Guyman set up in Northern California, and of course there was the WWAMI system that incorporated all these other states, Oregon did not join WWAMI. It had its own medical school, which is much older than the University of Washington's medical school. And the Oregon Medical School was founded like decades before, like 1876, I think. And so the people here did not want to be part of WWAMI. And yet there was this, well, so what's the training philosophy really? Okay, it's certainly not community-based. There were no community residencies. All the residencies in every specialty were at OHSU, okay? At that time, it was the University of Oregon Medical School, okay? Anyway, the dean was worried that the university would lose its funding. And so he wanted to make a trip out to reassure these doctors in Enterprise and to listen to them about what should be done, okay? And he wanted somebody from the family medicine department to go out there. And Bob had something that he was doing and couldn't go. And so he said he wanted me to go out there, right? So I made a trip, which now Enterprise is about a 6-hour drive from Portland. And we had a state car, and it was the dean and associate dean of the medical school and me in the car for 6 hours one way. And then we had lunch with those guys. We stayed the night, and then we came back. Well, it's a pretty good faculty development opportunity to spend 12 hours alone with your dean. It was a really interesting time to talk about why no specialty but family medicine could fix this problem, because there aren't anybody else that can practice in a town like Enterprise. You need general surgeons and you need family doctors in those towns, and you need something that can pass as a mental health system. But you certainly don't need dermatologists out there, okay? So it's sort of like, well, maybe we need a bigger family medicine program. Maybe we need to do some of these rural training sites. You know, Spokane had a rural training program that was attached to it at the time. And there were successful rural training programs in places like Duluth and Greeley, Colorado. And I knew about all those places because I went to the PDW. I interacted with program directors. So they really got interested in that. And what actually happened then was a meeting with the legislators from that area. So the senator from that area was a man named Mike Thorne, who was a rancher from Pendleton. And the person from the House of Representatives that was there was a guy named Gene Timms, who was a rancher from Burns, both Republicans. And both went down there and talked about the importance of adequately resourcing the medical school in the state to solve the rural health crisis. Mike Thorne became the president of the chair of the search committee that hired the new university president. And the new university president was brought here with a mandate to fix rural health. Well, if you're the Department of Family Medicine at OHSU, that is a really good thing for you, okay? Because he's got nowhere to turn but us for how to fix this. And most of the other departments' attitudes was, well, that's just stupid. That's just a political problem you have. It's not an academic problem. But ultimately, a grant was obtained to completely overhaul the School of Medicine's curriculum. We got a statewide AHEP grant. That associate dean kind of became empowered to change medical education to produce the kind of doctor our state needed, okay? And that really meant more primary care, more family medicine, and more generalism, you know, more general surgeons. That was really important too from the beginning. Well, and the state elected John Kitzhaber to be the governor, who was a physician and a graduate of our medical school and doing emergency medicine down in Roseburg. John had, and a group of people had this idea for the Oregon Health Plan, which was a universal access system before the Clinton Health Plan was thought up. The idea is we're going to cover everybody in Oregon by expanding Medicaid and having an employer mandate, right? And this was actually happening. Kitzhaber was elected, and we got to about 1992 or 1993, and it was clear that the state was going to expand Medicaid up to 100% of poverty, enroll 400,000 new people in state coverage. And this was, you know, we're talking 1993 here, okay? Long time before the Affordable Care Act and before the Clinton Health Plan was even being debated. I felt like I did not know how to operate a residency if all of the patients were going to be in managed care systems, because that felt to me like it was going to be a population health focus that was really different than what we were doing. I had been the program director for 7 years, I think. And this associate dean and the president that was recruited wanted me to come help this happen at the level of the president's office. And the thing that really turned it was the university decided to partner with the county health department in Multnomah County in Portland to start a managed care system to implement the Oregon Health Plan in Metro Portland.
Hey, John, before you go into that, which I just asked you to do, the whole inside the president's office stuff, which is pretty impressive. Back to that drive from Enterprise back to Portland, 6 hours. Were you able to convince them, the dean and the associate dean, that family medicine was the only way to fix that? Or was the fixing the political activity you talked about later from the Republican docs out there? I mean, legislators out there.
So I would say both the dean and the associate dean were people who had grown up in small towns. And although the dean was a research endocrinologist from the VA, he had grown up in a small town and knew about why you couldn't really do small town medicine without general practice. They mostly wanted to talk about how hard this was going to be to convince the faculty of the medical school to do. Okay, how are we going to make this how are we going to get this through the faculty senate or through the School of Medicine's curriculum committee? How are we going to get those things done? And I would say they didn't need me to convince them that family medicine could help. What they needed was that to understand that the needs of the community. So the needs of the community are viewed from the medical school as an outside force. Okay. And what needed to change was the medical school needed to consider itself responsible for the citizens of our state. The minute you decide that, then you can't write these small towns off and say, well, just send all the pregnant ladies to Portland. That'll be fine. Okay. Because that's what people in departments at the medical school would tend to say. Well, we're fine here. Our job is to take care of the people in our place and to train doctors to do that. And if rural Oregon has a problem, that's not the medical school's issue. Okay. And I would say they really do think that. And that flows from the fact that a lot of leaders in medical schools come from private medical schools. Like if you want to be a dean, go to Harvard or Yale, right? But Harvard or Yale don't really have a public mission, do they? So these guys show up in these positions, and it's sort of like, well, I don't understand why the people in rural Oregon think that their lack of health care is a medical school's problem. Okay. And you have to say, well, it's everybody's problem. The medical school is part of everybody, isn't it? You know? And so these arguments about how do we talk about this, but the thing that was not very far below the surface is, well, we have to get the other members of the faculty to think that what you're doing is an intellectually rigorous thing. Okay, that we're not trying to train second-rate doctors so that they'll go to enterprise.
Now that's a tough challenge, of course.
Well, and so I said, well, then we need to get faculty out to see what the doctors in enterprise do, because not one of them could last a day out there. Okay. And there had been several departmental connections. The cardiology division at OHSU had a working relationship with enterprise. The hospital out there had one of its 30 beds that was a coronary care unit with a monitor bed, so that they could try to have people not die of heart attacks there, because there wasn't, a bevy of specialists. Okay. And so we got really interested in studying that, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so the academic legitimacy of the department was a really, really important part of convincing that. Okay. Now, I would say we were working on academic legitimacy, but what we had, Dan, was unequivocal clinical legitimacy, because we agreed to do everything. Okay. So in my second year on the faculty, when there were only 6 or 7 of us, the ophthalmology chair announces in a department chair's meeting that they're going to send all of their preoperative medical assessments to family medicine and not to internal medicine, because the internists have a crappy clinic. People can't get appointments there. They don't turn them around fast enough. And I can't make a living if my surgery schedule is delayed by the stupid internist. So family medicine is going to do all of our pre-op evaluations from now on. And we did that for 20 years. They moved their business away from internal medicine because we had evening clinics at the time. We had evening clinics in the 1980s. We covered our practice 24/7. We went to the ER and saw all of our own patients there. And by the early 90s, we were doing our own C-sections. Okay. So we were not seen as a bunch of docs that referred patients to specialists all the time. And I remember when we got the first person C-section privileges in the department, the argument was, how can I train a resident to go to enterprise and do a C-section with no backup from you guys, if the family doctors here on campus with backup from you guys cannot safely do one? We must be able to show these residents that this care is high quality and safe. And you have to help me do that. But otherwise, we'll just be going out there and doing procedures that you won't, quote, let us do here. Well, we don't want you to let us do anything. We want you to care about what we're able to do when we leave here, so that the C-section rate and perinatal mortality rate in this state goes down and not up. And you see, we have this problem in the country now, don't we? The perinatal outcomes for the country are getting worse because the training programs are happy that things are good inside of their walls. And their stupid solution to these problems will just send everybody here. But see, you will never get the outcomes you want if you're not out where the people are in the community. That's a basic principle of family medicine. So I didn't find it that hard. The administration was not hard to convince. The specialty faculty were not that hard to convince. Our biggest problem was the basic scientists, okay, who did not think that we were serious scholars, and they didn't see credible research happening with us. And the research we did, they didn't understand, right? So I remember they were talking about, well, I think, I got accused once in a chairs meeting by a basic science chair of not caring about the basic sciences. And I said, well, I care a lot about the basic sciences. I just think we have the wrong ones here. Because there's no department of anthropology or sociology or cognitive psychology here. What you guys do is really great basic training for physicians, but it doesn't help me in practice because family doctors are social scientists, not biological scientists. How come I have nobody here that understands the kind of science I do? Okay.
And what was the answer?
Well, the answer was, well, medical schools have always had departments of biochemistry. We've created the biomedical revolution that way. Well, I said, I'm not arguing that you should be gotten rid of. I'm just saying that my partners are actually more down at Portland State and at the University of Oregon than here. Okay? Because the methods are different and the questions are different if you're asking population and social science questions than if you're asking biological questions. Does that make sense? So ultimately, this leads to, so I go down and I start this managed care program. I get put in charge of all of the university's primary care practices. I have a title of vice president for regional education of the university. I report directly to this president who had been recorded. I was, by all people's criteria, by the mid 90s, I was the rising star here who was gonna, do great things. But it didn't really turn out like that. And I would say it didn't turn out like that for several reasons. The first is the more I got involved with that, the less happy I was. I have never in my career been as lonely as I was between 1995 and 1998 because I wasn't around learners. I was around legislators and people, insurance company people, and hospital executives. I found myself in meetings arguing about money all the time, like all the time, with people who mostly thought that that's what matters, right? And I felt like I was not doing what I had come there to do, right? I'm becoming an administrator, and I didn't really like it. I think I was good at it, but I wasn't happy at it. And so I jumped at the chance when Bob decided to step down in 98 to come back and be the chair of the Department of Family Medicine. The university president was unhappy with me about that. And it was kind of like, well, that's going to make it really hard for you to do anything else after this because people don't really, you're outside of your department. Going back to your department is a step back in your career, okay? And I think if you look at academic progression of university presidents and deans, that's probably true. That was probably good advice. But ultimately, I was reaching the point where the last thing I wanted to be was like him. I had meetings with him every month. I have a letter over here, which is the letter I wrote him in 2003, which was sort of like a really, really polite letter telling him that he had lied to me and to the legislature, and I was not going to put up with it.
That doesn't sound too polite.
It said, so the letter said, I want you to, I have a problem and I need your help in figuring out how to explain the problem to the members of the Rural Caucus and the AHEC boards from around the state. Attached is a memo in which we promised a $500,000 investment in the next biennium to the AHEC program. And it is clear that that's not in the budget, and you've told me that that can't be done. Since we have a letter promising them that we were going to do it and it's not going to be done, I need your help to explain why we're not living up to our promise.
Yeah.
Okay? Now that's a polite way of saying you've broken your promise, and you don't even want to do them the courtesy of going to a meeting with them and explaining why. Okay? You want me to go to the meeting and explain why. But I didn't make the decision, Kimosabe. Okay. Now, this goes back to a little bit about all of the accusations going on in the political world right now about people who work for Trump and whether they gave away their integrity doing that. I think I need to be a loyal vice president to the president. But at some point in time, I'm not going to have my integrity undermined by decisions that I don't get any say in. Okay. So it was that sort of thing. I saw it as an integrity problem, and he saw it as a loyalty problem. Okay.
Well, that is what we're going through now. And
it is. And I actually think there's just no substitute for telling people the truth, right? Telling people the truth.
And having integrity.
Yeah. So the nice thing is I stayed in charge of all of the primary care system, and I came back to the Department of Family Medicine, and I was extremely happy being the chair of family medicine from 1998 until 2016, so for 18 years. During that time, the department grew. The year after I stopped being the chair, it moved into the #1 ranked spot in the country in U.S. News and World Report. I was able to get somebody who was the exact right person to take over the position when I stepped down. And I stepped down when I was only 60 because I didn't want the position to be the defining thing, right? I wanted Jen DeVoe to be able to move into the spot. And if we're serious about having women leaders and having minority leaders, then white guys need to get out of the way sometimes. And it was an opportunity for me to go back to essentially all of my professional activity at OHSU since 2016 has been clinical work. So I attend on patient service, and I see my own patients. And I told the residents, I want you to see, I don't need the money. I'm practicing because it's a worthy endeavor, and it's fun to do, and I like it. And I want you to see it as a choice that you make, not something that you have to do.
So. Well, that's one of the things that has so impressed me and many, many others about your entire trajectory during all of those phases. And I want to get to some of what's after stepping down, not only from the chair, which you just described a little bit about, but stepping down from the editorship of Family Medicine. But tell us a little bit more about some of your other, if you will, political things. I know you were president, now specific to the academies. You were president of the Oregon Academy. You won the Tom Johnson Award from the Academy for lifetime commitment to education. Tell us some more about that, as well as other things I may not know about.
So I think I teach this course in leadership for our residents here, in which I use different quotes and talk about how differently I would define what good leadership is at different stages of my career. I mean, I started off as an ROTC student learning about military leadership and how the Army thinks about that and what they train officers to think about that. I would say during the 80s and 90s, when I was a residency director and in these various roles, I had the commonly held belief that administrative leadership was important, and that if you got in charge of something, you could do good. Okay, so I wanted to get in charge of things. When the Program Directors Association first formed, the program directors were mad that there were no residency directors on the RRC, and that we were not able to get the RRC to listen to things that we thought were important. So there was originally an idea that an association of community hospital residency directors would form. And this was something that Al Haley and Dick Layton and Chuck Payton and Norm Kahn was involved in this. And I got called because I was a university guy, and I obviously did not think it was in the specialty's best interest to have an association of community hospital residency directors. I thought that was ridiculous, and that it should be an association of all residency directors. And so there was a planning committee. I eventually became the fourth president of AFMRD, and in part because of that, and because of a very fortuitous, like, serendipitous thing that happened. So when Bob Taylor was gone and I was the acting chair, we had a visiting professorship. And I hatched the idea of inviting Bob Petersdorf to be the visiting professor of family medicine in Oregon. Now, he was at the time the executive director of the AAMC and a legendary academic internist, like a hero, an Oslerian hero to the internist. I've always found that really funny about internists, the way they have these hero worship things about their field. You know, it's really kind of very, it's just a characteristic they have, right? But I figured, well, what if we invite Petersdorf to come out here and be a visiting professor? And if we intentionally pick the visiting professorship a week that the University of Washington has a home football game, because he was in Seattle before he went to the AAMC, and his son works at the Fred Hutch. And I bet if he got a free ticket to come out here, that we could convince him to come to Oregon in order to visit his grandkid if we were really smart about it. And wouldn't it fog the internist glasses if Bob Petersdorf came here to be a visiting professor in our department? What could happen? He could tell us no, right? Well, he came out here, and it was a very successful professorship, and I got to talk to him. At the time, the AAFP was threatening to try to link the production of rural physicians with NIH funding priorities. I don't know if you remember those days, right?
Yeah.
And the AAMC were terrified that that was going to happen. And so when I had my meeting with Petersdorf at the end of his professorship, I said, what advice would you give family medicine about how to be more successful in the academic world? And Petersdorf said, well, first of all, give up on this thing about NIH funding and rural production. He goes, you're going to be a pariah in the academic world if you pursue that. You have no idea how that will piss everybody off, and it will harm your specialty for a generation. And I said, I you know, when you're in these meetings, you can say anything you want. I said, well, you seem to think that the Academy of Family Physicians cares at all about NIH funding. They don't care about that. They're trying to figure out how to get your attention, and they think they're being ignored about this rural health problem. And to be honest with you, they have reason to think that. So if you were to actually do something about that, take that seriously, they'll abandon that in a heartbeat. But you have to show them that the medical schools collectively care about this problem of access to care in communities around the country. That's what they're looking for. Well, remember, he started the Office of the Generalist Physician, right? And he talked about his visit to Oregon from the podium at that fall's AAMC meeting. And he came up to me. So he was here like in October. And in November at that year's AAMC meeting, he came up to me and said, I've decided to appoint you to the ACGME. Okay. So I thought, well, okay. I wasn't sure I knew what that meant. I didn't know what that meant. I knew what the Residency Review Committee for Family Medicine was, but he wasn't talking about that. He was talking about the ACGME. At that point, the AAMC had 4 appointees. The AMA had 4. The CMSS had 4. You know, they were appointed to this organization. So I got appointed to the ACGME. The other 3 people were the dean at West Virginia, the dean at Emory, and the CEO of the UCLA Health System. And I was 20 years the junior of all of them. Okay. And I got a political education that is like, I'm telling you what, the wheeling and dealing that went on behind the scenes between ABMS and double, I'm like, oh my goodness. Okay. But what did I learn from that? Well, the main thing that was accomplished during my tenure on the AAMC was the 80-hour work week. It was not something we could have stopped, no matter whether we wanted to stop it or not. I actually think it's done more harm than help to the profession of medicine. Okay. So I'm not particularly proud that I was there and was one of the 23 people that voted on that. I voted for it because I didn't think there was any choice. You know, we were going to have all kinds of legal problems if we didn't, because of the whole Libby Zion thing. But the point I'm getting at is I was starting to get disenchanted that being the dean or the president or the RRC chair or the STFM president or the academy president really gave you the chance to do anything. Okay. That whether it was worth all the travel and all the time, because when you're off doing that, you're not with young people. And the things that have mattered in my career, I am sure at the end, are the people I've spent time with, not the roles I've been in. Okay. That Scott Fields was a resident under in my program that I helped to train Jenny DeVoe. There was a year where the STFM president, the AAFP Foundation president, and the AAFP president were all former students of mine. That, in my view, is what matters. Okay, in the end, that's what matters. And maybe it isn't what matters to everybody, but it's what matters to me. I will tell you one other thing about organizational leadership that's funny, though. So in 1993, I was the AFMRD president. And a couple of years later, I was the Oregon State Academy president, and then went off to be a member of that Congress of Delegates from Oregon. But in 2013, I got elected STFM president, right? Now, what is the significance of this? Well, when I went to the working party meetings in 2013, I was in the last 10 years of my career. When I went to the working party meetings in 1993, I was in the first 10 years of my career. I went to working party meetings 20 years apart as an organizational president. And it was really interesting to look at how the specialty had changed, right? Like the working party in 1993 was a friendly group of people that got together. There were cocktails to be had, and we talked about common problems.
John, I got to stop you a second. For interpretation, explain the working party, the family of family medicine.
So going way, way, way back to the early days of the specialty, and you would be more well-versed in the history of this than me, but there was a biannual, twice yearly getting together of the presidents, originally of the ABFP, now ABFM, and the Academy. And STFM's president got included, and then NAPCRAG's president got included, and ADFM, the department chairs group, and AFMRD, the foundation, these group people, the presidents, president-elects, and past presidents, and executives of those organizations all would come together for a meeting. And the hosting of the meeting moves from organization to organization. But it's an attempt to get together and talk about shared problems in the future of the specialty. A lot of our big strategic efforts like Family Medicine for America's Health or the Future Family Medicine Project were launched at the working party meeting. It's no longer called the working party because people didn't want it thought of as a party, I think. And I think it has a new name, the Family Medicine Consortium or something like that. But it's an opportunity for the leaders of these organizations to meet with the other organizations and to try and figure out how to hammer out a common approach to things, even though the organizations have different memberships, have different priorities, if you would. But it was really interesting for me because a lot of people are president of one of these organizations, maybe, and they get to do this for 3 years. But I got to be a president early and a president late, and to kind of learn about, well, how does the specialty talk to itself? about the problems that we're trying to figure out how to solve. Does that make sense?
Sure, and I can certainly, and I won't, comment in detail about the very beginning. And it was extraordinarily collegial, and it was all about talking to each other. And I was, of course, there in an executive role, not in a presidential role. And we would talk about, what are the issues? What not so much fighting between us, but what are the issues together we should all address for the good of the specialty? So I was not there at the end when you were there in the 2013 timeframe. So just a quick note. Uh, what was the major change you saw when you went back the second time?
So I wouldn't say that there was acrimony. That I don't want to imply that. There wasn't disagreement. There wasn't debate. Um, the specialty had become very big. And it was really, and I think today still struggles to think about itself in a unified way. So what does a research faculty member who's a member of NAPCRAG have in common with a rural family doctor from rural Colorado? The rural family doctor is a member of the Colorado Academy and the AAFP, and they're a diplomat of the board. So they have some agency in those organizations. The NAPCRAG researcher may not even be a physician, may or may not be a member of STFM, but really wants a voice at the table about what family medicine's priorities ought to be, right? So to make a tent big enough to represent all those points of view, like it's always been fascinating to me. That's an issue with STFM. So when I was STFM president, I'm trying to explain to the working party, a third of the members of STFM are not physicians. They care a lot about whether the Affordable Care Act works or not, and they want a voice in that. STFM is their voice. The Academy is not their voice because they can't be Academy members. And as a physician, I want the Academy to be my voice, because to have STFM doing that is a disrespectful to community family doctors. Okay. So why is it that we have to argue about whose voice is whose? Why can't we sing like a choir? Okay. Why can't we all agree that the lead in each piece of music is going to depend on the expertise that we need from the singer, right? Well, I just think that becomes hard when you get really, really big and very diverse. Okay. I started off here in Oregon, to use our department as a metaphor, Dan. There were 6 of us in Bob Taylor. 5 of the 6 were, I think, 5 of the 6, 5 of the 7 were men. All of us were white. We shared a dozen donuts, and we decided what we're going to do. And then we went out and did everything all with each other. But today we operate 7 or 8 clinical practices. We have 4 residency programs. We have over 200 faculty, and none of them know all of the others. So to lead an organization like that becomes a much more of a corporate thing and much less of a family business thing. Okay. And I was part of taking the department through that transition, but it would not be Bob, the way Bob would handle things is he'd get us all together and we'd hammer it out. You can't get them all in the same room now. Okay, even before COVID, you can't get people from Klamath Falls and out in Scappoose and, research faculty members who have an NIH deadline and work at night all the time. Okay, and yet they are all part of your department. And so to build a culture that really has that strength, that requires a different set of approaches to leadership skills, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. And even within the Academy, I retired in 2013. And in the last several years there, that was becoming apparent in that we had to become more of a business entity. And to my chagrin, we became less of an educational entity. And I'm so pleased that the other organizations within the Working Party do that, because the Academy wasn't as interested in that anymore. I need to take you to a couple other ways, and then I'm going to ask you a couple of provocative questions, as if none of the others have been provocative. Tell me about your books. The one that I'm most intrigued with is your most recent book, about which you and I have talked before. And it's the only book I am aware of written by a family physician that's really designed for your kids or kids. And that's about, if you will, knowledge, if I'm not messing this up, knowledge and belief. What is known and what is believed, which in a theological term is epistemology, and not a theologian, and neither are you, but nevertheless, epistemology is just very important for right now, and maybe in the current time of the last 6 years. What is knowledge and what is misguided belief? Talk about your books. First of all, that one, and then just at least mention the others.
So the first book I did, if you grow up in a department with Bob Taylor, you get opportunity. You get opportunities to do books because he has lots of connections in the publishing industry. And so I was writing chapters in his books. I told you how lonely I was between 2016 or between 1996 and 1999, that period of time. That was also at a time when family medicine, everybody thought that the family medicine was going to take over the country, And McGraw-Hill did not have a textbook of family medicine. Saunders had one with Rakel, and Springer Verlag had one with Bob. And so McGraw-Hill, as the publishers of big textbooks and all the other specialties, wanted to do one. And I needed to say things about family medicine then. So I signed a deal, which was maybe the craziest thing I ever did. I signed a book deal with McGraw-Hill to provide 2,000 manuscript pages in 18 months.
Oh.
Okay. And I did provide 2,000 manuscript pages in under 18 months. Now, a lot of those were chapters I had other people write, but I wrote the whole first section of the book myself. And it was the first time in my career where I told you that when I came to Oregon, I wanted to learn enough about scholarship so that I could survive in academic medicine. I saw scholarship as a ticket to punch, as something I needed to do in order to be able to do what I really wanted to do. Because I wanted to be a teacher and a clinician, and I wanted to influence students and residents. And I needed to do enough scholarship. And I did. I got promoted to associate professor. I got promoted to full professor. I had become the chair of the department around this time. I was already a full professor, and I get a chance to do this flagship book. But people read this book, and there were lots of people that I never have met in my life that were influenced by it. I made a trip to Japan, and people wanted me to sign copies of it all over the place. And they published copies of it in Polish and in Chinese, and chapters of it were published in Chinese medical journals without my permission. But the bottom line is it reached a lot of people. I did a handbook edition of that. I did a book on healthcare and spirituality with a faculty member in our department who was a theologian, about how to talk to patients about faith. It was a medical book for physicians and for mental health professionals about how to recognize spiritual crisis and how to partner with people so that you're not talking about religion with patients, but you're not ignoring the fact that religion matters to a lot of them, right? So that book was published by a British publisher, and it did okay. I mostly did it because Steve Cleaver really wanted to work on this book, and I was trying to help and mentor him, right? When I got done being the chair of family medicine, and my job since 2016 has been seeing patients about 25% of my time, including inpatient care at the university, and editing the journal. And those collectively are about a half-time job. So I've been working about half-time for the last 5 years, and I wanted to start some writing projects. I have a collection of stories I want to do. I have ideas for novels in my head. But my grandchildren were reaching the age in which they go through confirmation and get confirmed in the church. And it became clear to me that one of the things I was hearing in the news is the gradual confusion of what it means to believe things versus know them. Okay, this is it's an epistemic problem. If I tell you I know something, but my criteria for determining knowing it is really, really different than your assumption about my criteria for knowing it, right? So if you're going to write a book about this and you're not a philosopher, well, the first thing you do is you go, I mean, I've got a whole shelf of books up here. I read a whole bunch of epistemology text, okay? Collections of writings about that, issues of moral philosophy. I just spent a lot of my newfound time reading about that. And then I decided that I wanted to write something that would be understandable at the high school level, that I wanted to be able to hand this to my grandchildren when they're 8th or 9th graders and they're in confirmation at the church and say, so the most important thing you can do to have a happy life is to decide what you truly believe in and then live that way. And I'm not talking religion here. Believe it or not, when I came to Oregon, I told you about that trip that my wife and I came out here in 1985 to interview for the job. I was asked to give a talk to the residents, and the talk I gave was entitled The Theology of Family Medicine, okay? And the point I was trying to make is family doctors are held together by what we believe in, not by what we know, right? Now, Bob tells me afterwards, well, that was a wonderful talk, John, but you had the wrong title, because talking about the belief versus knowing is not theology, it's ideology, or it's epistemology, because theology is about the study of God, and you didn't talk about God, okay? So theology is not really where I am here. Where I am here is more, well, what does it mean to believe something? What is the boundary between believing something and knowing it? And how is the way I choose beliefs and then either change them or retain them over time sort of the defining characteristic of what's really important in my life? And I wanted to be able to say that to my grandchildren at that point in their lives, and then find out what happens, well, what happens with the book, right? So first of all, I write this thing. I try to include a lot of stories and a lot of quotes in it, little philosophical quotes that match what I'm trying to say there. I wrote the first section of the book about how children believe things, okay? So I'll give you an example. Most American families, the children believe in Santa Claus, right? And the parents encourage them to believe that Santa Claus comes on Christmas Eve and comes down the chimney and leaves presents in the stocking, and that we tell children that. Is that a lie, right? If we're telling them something that we know is false, then it really isn't true that a real being comes down the chimney with gifts, right? When children discover that Santa Claus is not a real person that comes down the chimney, do they think their parents have lied to them? No, not at all. They understand that the story is a metaphor. It's a metaphor for the spirit of giving at Christmas. Little children don't understand metaphors. They think that stories are real. And so you believe things as a child because adults that you respect, usually your parents, tell you you should believe them. But part of being and not being a child, growing up to be an adult, is to decide what to believe and what not to believe based on other things, right? Based on what your own experiences are, based on what other people suggest, but mostly based on what you want to be known for, or what you want to have at the foundation of who you are. So I want my grandchildren to find important beliefs and scrutinize them based on whether they're valid or not, and then live that way. Like I talked about being honest and the falling out I had with the university president. Well, that was a moral question of right and wrong from my point of view. Okay. I don't bring these things up in professional work very much, although there was a time when we were having a meeting about cutting off the Medicaid patients' access to our clinics. And I said, well, we're not going to do that. And the person that was leading the meeting said, well, we may lose clinics if we keep seeing patients that pay at this lower rate. And I said, I'm not worried about losing clinics. I'm worried about losing my soul. I promise to take care of everybody no matter what. And we're not going to compromise that. Okay. So, and and so why is that something I want to really stick to? Because that belief is an important part of who I think I am, if that makes any sense. So I want my grandchildren to be able to believe things deeply and live according to their beliefs. And I wanted to try and explain to them why that's important. So I wrote this little book. I found a publisher. It was really funny. I was just hunting around and I found this independent publisher in Eugene, Oregon, which has just been a wonderful partner to work with, very independent. I got a theologian to work with me as editor of the books to get help about whether I was saying inappropriate things about religion. And so we'll see. Right now, I'm proud of it. I think the people who read it like it. I've given it to my oldest grandson, and it will go to two others this year that are in the 8th grade now. And then the two 5th graders will get it in a couple of years. And
tell us the publisher.
The publisher is Whiffenstock, WIPF. If you just do a Google search, johnsaultz.com, there is a website there, and there's a link to the publisher. They can find the book there.
Okay.
Whiffenstock is the publisher, and it's cheap. I think they sell it for $15. You can get it for $12 if you don't. I think you can get it for $12 from the publisher, but you have to pay them $3 to ship it or something like that. It's $15. But Norm Kahn read it. And we had a couple of really wonderful philosophical discussions about it and about religion and how religion has been important to Norm.
Well, you've mentioned several people, and I talked to Norm as a very knowledgeable Jew, and
Yeah.
I as at least somewhat knowledgeable Christian, and we have those talks frequently. So I'm not at all surprised you did as well. As long as you mention a name, I got to go back to a couple that you said. Both Scott Fields and Jen Defoe. I mean, both absolutely stars that I have encountered over the years as well. So you've certainly done a good job with your progeny. Let me go forward and ask you about some people. So I'm just going to throw out a name, and I want you to, even if you don't know them, because some of these people are no longer here or didn't know them, just say what you think about the person if you know them. Laurel Case.
So I actually knew Laurel Case really well. He was the founding chair here in Oregon, and I tell Laurel Case's story to every class of residents here because he was the president of the Oregon Academy of Family Physicians with one of the state's most successful general practices down in Medford in 1968 when the specialty was starting. The legislature in this state mandated that OHSU, then the University of Oregon's medical school, have a family medicine department in the next 2 years or they would not get state funding anymore. The dean, who was not a supporter of the idea, didn't know what to do about that, but knew that he didn't want to lose state funding. So they called the current president of the Oregon Academy and asked if he'd come up here and be the chair of a family medicine department at a medical school. Laurel Case went to medical school at the University of Kansas. He was a quiet, gentle, loving, unassuming family man with a wife and 2 sons who was happy as a clam in Medford. And they asked him to get rid of his practice, move his teenage sons from Medford to Portland, which is a 280-mile move, and to become a faculty member in a medical school with no qualifications, and to have the medical school mostly not want him there. And Laurel agreed to do that. Okay. So I tell our residents all the time, what have you done that has any kind of risk in it that's the equal of that? Right? Everything we're doing here is because Laurel Case said yes to that. And frankly, there were a bunch of challenges that he faced. He was really proud to have, I think, been on the residency review committee for family medicine, or the RAP consultant program there for a little while, but he had very little external role. He did the job for about 10 years, and then he stepped down and they recruited Bob Taylor. The way I know Laurel and Betty Case is at the end of their lives, I was their doctor.
Oh,
So
wow.
Laurel, they were both in a senior living facility. Laurel had problems with dementia. Betty died 4 or 5 years after Laurel and was herself a formidable person. She wrote books about parenting twins because she was a twin and they had twin boys. And so we started the Laurel Case visiting professorship here when I was the chair of the department. And although Laurel never ever belonged in a medical school, I mean, it was like putting a guppy in a shark tank, right? Frankly, but everybody by the time he finished respected his humanity and his kindness and his honesty, and I consider him a pretty great man.
Wow. I knew him when he was on the AAFP Commission on Education, and while he was the founding chair, but I did not know much of what you just said, including the fact that you took care of them in their final days. That's pretty.
Yeah, so
That,
I know him pretty well, actually, in a pretty personal sense.
yeah. Um, oh, how about Marion Bishop? You know, we were talking about physicians and non-physicians. Marion, non-physician.
So I remember being kind of in awe at what a force of nature Marion Bishop was, mostly interacting with her by going to STFM meetings early in my career. That she would always wear these bright colored dresses and be very, very such an outspoken and passionate advocate for the beliefs of what matters most in family medicine. So we talked about the book about beliefs, and I've always believed that what holds our specialty together are those beliefs, and you don't need to have an MD degree or a DO degree to have them. A lot of our most important leaders, like Marion Bishop, belonged in our family. Anita Taylor belongs in our family. The beliefs that define us, they are as passionate about as anybody else that's there, right? Marion was, of course, for years at Utah. She had a belief in, of course, I was a Bishop Fellow with a fellowship in 2003 that was funded by the Bishop family with the hopes of producing more deans and vice presidents for health affairs. I think the place where Mary and I probably didn't see things completely eye to eye is she thought the world would be better if a lot of our best leaders became deans and vice presidents for health affairs.
Right.
And I don't personally believe that. I think that the risk would be that it would be very harmful to our specialty. Family doctors that enter those positions of leadership are damaged more than they help the system a lot of the time.
Wow, that's a huge statement.
In other words, you get to be the chief medical officer of this health system, and you find that your values get lost in the transition, if that makes sense. Now, I don't think that's always the case. And obviously, Norm Kahn and I have had great debates about this, because Norm really, really believes that getting into positions of leadership are opportunities to make things better. I certainly agree with that. I just think that from an academic sense, when I'm in the C-suite arguing about the budget, I'm not in the classroom talking to students. And the long-term impact of one, I told you at the beginning of this about that moment with Bill Morris that made me a family doctor. That was a really big deal for me. And Bill Morris probably didn't even know it was happening at the time. But it's pretty good that he was on call that night. Do you see what I'm saying? So Marion really feels like, she how to get and use power was something that interested her a lot. And I admire that a lot in her. I very much admired that what a talented mentor she was. And she would call me sometimes I mean, she called me after I had been on the Council of Academic Societies and my term ended representing AFMRD, whether I would want to be the STFM representative to the Council on Academic Societies. I said, Marion.
Which she was for many years.
Right. I said, Marion, I did that for 6 years from AFMRD, and I think I will go crazy if I have to go to another one of those meetings. So, no, I've been there, done that. She goes, but you could really change the AAMC. I said, Marion, that is not a windmill that I want to tilt at. There's too much required, and I don't think it. Yeah, no.
that makes me go back to your discussion about Bob Petersdorf, then the CEO of the AAMC, because watching him from the beginning of his time there to his final time at the AAMC, he underwent a conversion. And I have a feeling that the story you described about him coming to Portland to be a visiting professor and then going up to Seattle, where his son was at Hutchinson, you probably caused a conversion. Are you an evangelist or something that I wasn't aware of?
So I think there were probably a lot of things that contributed to it. The trip to Oregon probably helped. I also think that, like a lot of people, he went into that role pretty underestimating. So Petersdorf encountered the behavior of the New York teaching hospitals around some health reform issues. And remember, the AAMC has constituents, but the Council of Teaching Hospitals is sort of the other side of the other arm to the Council of Deans. The Council of Deans think that they're really important, but when it comes to throwing money around, the New York teaching hospitals have killed more good ideas at the AAMC. And I think Petersdorf actually got kind of fed up with that, okay? Because it was sort of like, well, these guys have no bounds about the social mission of the medical school versus the financial performance of the medical school. And I think it got to be too much for him, if that makes sense, because he was a decent guy in there, but he liked to make it hard to find, right? He could be grouchy, but he was a good guy and a smart guy, and smart enough to get into that position and smart enough to realize that, yeah, well, what are you actually driving here?
Well, John, I need to get a couple more things in before we make it so long nobody will read this. One more name. The first two were no longer with us, but this one is vibrant, and I see him very frequently here in Kansas City. Bob Graham.
Oh my. Well, sometimes, like, I know that Bob Taylor hold Bob Graham in extremely high esteem. He holds you in really high esteem. And so I met Bob Graham much the same way I met you. I'm sure, introduced to him by Bob at a meeting. Okay. So a really, really decent guy who's just smart off the charts and I admire Bob Graham the most for his consistent integrity. And I think the Academy had that integrity while he was there. Okay. Sometimes you notice these things more when they go away than when they first come. That makes any sense? Bob, it would have been really hard to fill Bob's shoes at the Academy. But the problems, from my point of view, the frustrations I have with the Academy over the tenure of the last 10 or 12 years has mostly been that they got away from the things that I really cared about at the core of what I want to be an Academy member for. The education, the social advocacy that's neither political nor conservative, but values-based, right? It's not about trying to get family doctors to do well. It's about trying to get the American people to do well. Okay, and it's not hard to tell the difference between self-advocacy and public advocacy, I think. And in a member organization like the Academy, it's really hard to resist self-advocacy because your members are paying dues and they want you to go and fix the reimbursement system. Okay. And Bob Graham always stood as somebody who could hold the coalition together and do the right thing in ways we all were proud of, right? And I don't want to say that necessarily all went away when Bob Graham left, but I will tell you that it's not been the same since. And I give him a great deal of credit for having kept it that way as long as he was able to keep it.
I have an observation about administration, and you clearly determined while you were doing that stint in the president's office at OHSU that you didn't feel for you that administration was where the decisions are made or the impact could be. But Bob Graham is clearly somebody who made impact at the federal level at Cincinnati, and certainly in the 15 years he was here at the academy as an administrator. I mean, that was his niche, and he did that very well. So I guess the takeaway from that is, I think, and it kind of goes back to your thought about in that book to your grandkids, think about what you believe and what you know, and it may be different for each of us, but go for it.
Yeah, well, and you're right about that. So you want to know where I finally got in all these talks with residents about leadership. I now see effective change within organizations is like the tumblers of a lock. You have to have it work at every level. So when I was the residency director, I needed to count on Bob to get me resources that I needed for the residency to be successful. If Bob didn't do that, I would be frustrated about the department not getting me what I needed. But when I was the chair, I could not fix anything at our Scappoose clinic because I'm not at our Scappoose clinic. I can only pick the right person to be there, right? So as a leader, Bob was able to empower people at other places in the system, from individual family medicine offices and state academies and staff departments and staff people at the academy. He was able to get all that to line up, and that is an amazing skill. But no matter how good you are at it up here, if you haven't got the right people down here, it doesn't happen. You're just preaching to people who can't do what you're asking them to do, right? So he was successful at getting the right people in these roles and inspiring the right people to help in these causes. And for me, it's not that I'm not good at those things, but I'm happiest where I am, where the people are, if that makes sense. And Bob would probably, I've been working with him since he took over the Bishop Fellows, the last 3 or 4 years of that. And then we built this Bishop Society thing, which he and I have sort of worked on that together. Bob, I think, would agree with me about that, because boy, you watch him at a Bishop Fellows meeting, he never says stuff. He asks stuff in ways that provoke discussion in the right way. He's just really like Bob Taylor in that sense, that he's able to do leadership in an almost sneaky way.
Well, I was going to ask you, I'm not going to do any more names, but one that I was thinking about, because there's so many, would be John Guyman. But instead of asking you about John Guyman as the name to which I want you to react, you and John have written stuff about generalism, about family medicine and internal medicine. And of course, John Guyman has been saying ever since I was a puppy that there ought to be one specialty of primary care, which combines family medicine and internal medicine. Comment on that and where you find yourself in that trajectory, if you will, from our roots as a general practitioner into family medicine, and where we might go if there were a single generalist specialty.
So we had a Portland regional or a Western Regional Academy of Western Regional STFM meeting here in Portland in 1988, and the department planned it. And one of the things that we had then was a debate. And it was supposed to be an intergenerational debate. John was to argue that one specialty for primary care would make primary care stronger, And I was asked to argue the counterpoint as the young guy. Okay. John and I have been really, really good friends since the 80s. I mean, I've visited his home up on the San Juans, and he sends me every copy of every book he writes. I edited a bunch of them for him. I just think he's one of the great people that our specialty has produced. And my thinking about this has moved in the direction of agreeing with John more and more over the course of my career. But I have a caveat about it. I think there already is only one primary care specialty. And we ought to insist at being recognized in that way. If people don't want to recognize that and don't want to join what we're doing, then I want to compete with them, not collaborate with them, because I'm by nature a person who thinks competition is good. I played sports in high school. I don't have any problem saying, if you don't want to do these things, then let's practice next door to each other and see where the patients go. Let's have departments next to each other and see where the students go. Because I am not compromising that I think primary care in America, in the world, should be organized by family. I think caring for adults and children is seminally important to quality in primary care, and I won't compromise about that, just to be nice to pediatricians and internists, okay? I don't need everybody in my practice. One of my partners at the waterfront practice is a pediatrician. She sees only children. She can't take call with us. I'm glad that there's one of her, but I wouldn't want 2 or 3 or 4 of her, because I like kids in my practice and I want one call system, okay? So I think that as a value, organizing primary care by family is important. I think medical care based in the community is important. And mostly, I think medical care is about the person with the disease, not the disease the person has. And the internists and pediatricians are trained in disease-oriented approaches. When they get into practice as generalists, they often leave that, and we have lots in common. When we got our first endowed professorship at OHSU, our first endowed professorship was a $2 million gift from Kaiser. And the man I recruited to fill it was a man named Rick Dio, who was trained as a general internist and was an extremely successful researcher about back pain. Much of what you know about how ineffective back surgery is for people with backaches is Rick Dio's work, okay? And I recruited him because he was a senior in his career. He's never going to get an endowed professorship in an internal medicine department, because he's a health services researcher, and because I was looking for leadership for a young scientist in my department from somebody who could do that. Rick came here as a professor of family medicine. By the time he retired, he would say that family medicine is where he belongs, okay? And it's where he belongs because he is our intellectual partner. He belongs with us. So it doesn't have anything to do with the specialty. It has to do with the core values of the field, right? So what I've said is I think we should have one primary care field at OHSU. I think it should be family medicine. I think we should do family-oriented care in every practice we have. If we have internists in a practice, we also have to have pediatricians and family doctors there, because we do not turn children away, okay? We do not turn pregnant women away. If the doc isn't a comprehensivist, the practice has to be, right? On the other hand, having some internists in the group is really, really helpful, because they bring another set of perspectives that I think enrich the department. The problem I have with them, Dan, is they're scared to be family doctors, okay? And part of the reason they're scared is that I think they're worried that they won't be seen as legitimate by other people in their own department. And mostly they're worried that they won't have access to medicine residents, okay? They're worried that they don't know how to be with us, if that makes any sense. So that is on us, because we need to make this field really hospitable. As hospitable as we've been to behavioral science faculty and to research faculty with PhDs in other fields, we should be able to be equally hospitable to people from other specialties. At the beginning, we were. Hiram Curry was a neurologist, and Jack Colwell was an internist. This specialty had a big tent early on, and I like having a big tent. I'm even okay with changing the name if we have to change it. I don't care about the name, but I care about the core principles. Does that make sense?
Sure, it makes sense, John. And our time is about up, and I need to tell you that this has been a fascinating time with you. I mean, your contributions from the very beginning and your history and where you're going in the future are very, very impressive. And I just am so pleased and honored to have been able to interview you. And it occurs to me that at the beginning, I didn't say anything about your CV. So at least you can tell us your current emeritus titles. I think that's plural.
So I'm a professor emeritus in the department, and that kind of is a fancy for people who aren't in academic life. That's sort of considered a fancy way of saying you're a famous old guy or a famous old gal, right? That it's an honorary title that you get. It doesn't amount to much. The university gives me free coffee anywhere I go, but that's because I'm old, not because I'm an emeritus professor, right? I will stop being the editor of the journal Family Medicine next May after 12 years in that role, and I plan to totally retire then. And I've had a grand time doing that. It's allowed me an opportunity to work with wonderful people on our team, a chance to write and comment about the evolving nature of our field. I'm really, really proud of how the journal has grown and gotten better over the 12-year time that I've been there. The fact that its previous editors include people like John Fry and Lynn Carmichael and Barry Weiss. I think I'm the fourth editor of the journal, which is a pretty big deal in like 50 years, right? So that's a cool thing. I think one of the things I'm proudest of that is not on my CV is that about 6 months or a year after I stepped down as the chair, the university decided to rename and endow the chair in family medicine at OHSU as the John and Sherry Saultz Chair of Family Medicine.
I did not know that.
So
congratulations.
One of my former students holds a professorship in my name and in my department. And the university did that. That wasn't an outside gift. So I may have made them mad from time to time, but I didn't make them mad enough for them to not do that. And, the new vice president for health affairs here was the surgery chair during my tenure. I was a part of recruiting him here, and is a man I hold in very high esteem. And I have no doubt that John Hunter was behind that. But Jen DeVoe is now the John and Sherry Saultz Endowed Chair of Family Medicine at OHSU. And that's not so bad. I think I can live with that.
John, thank you so much. We could have gone on for another couple of hours, but this is a really good synopsis. It's a cataloging, if you will, of your posterity, and hopefully a lot of people will look at it. I'm going to recommend it to a few whom you've mentioned as you've been talking, and I hope you do the same.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dan. Thanks for inviting me.